No one saw the whisperer, but someone died hearing it. Welcome to Agent Ash, I'm your host. I'd love to know, where are you joining us from tonight? Seeing your comments always makes my day. Let's begin. It had rained in the night, not with fury, but with the kind of slow, unhurried melancholy that lingers on windowsills and creeps into old stone. Oxford, in its early hours, was draped in fog so fine it looked sown from parchment ash, as though the city had been folded into a footnote. I remember pausing on Parks Road, coat collar upturned, watching the steam rise from the backs of the morning delivery vans like ghosts fleeing kitchens. St. Jerome's College, which most tourists never found, and many students barely remembered, stood hidden behind an archway of ivy-stained stone that always seemed one frost away from crumbling. It was one of the last to electrify its chapel, and possibly the last to install heating worth the name. There are places in Oxford, old ones, stubborn ones, that seem to resent the very century they live in. St. Jerome's was such a place. It held the cold in its lungs like a vow. Inside, a Latin tutorial staggered toward coherence. Room 3B, wood-panelled and smelling faintly of mildew and chalk, was dim even by Oxford standards. A single overhead lamp buzzed above the long oak table, illuminating the bowed heads of 4 undergraduates and the barely moving lips of Professor Edwin Latham. Latham was a figure one noticed only slowly, and then not easily forgot. His voice was a rasp, sanded down by decades of translating the Roman dead. He read Catullus that morning, though read may be generous. It was more a murmuring to the ghosts on the page than to the living students before him. Something about grief and kisses, I think. I forget the exact lines now. I only remember the stillness with which he recited them, like someone speaking to an old photograph. Outside in the corridor, something or someone disturbed the hush. A whispering argument, so faint it seemed the walls themselves were quarrelling. I caught only syllables, some quick and breathless flare of emotion, then a door closing with a decisive, papery thud. None of the students looked up. Latham, as ever, did not flinch. I wasn't there, of course. I'm piecing together fragments, fogged glass and faded ink. But I see it all now, with that peculiar clarity one finds only after the ending. That evening I was at the Randolph, alone, which is to say, in good company. A glass of claret breathing before me, my coat damp on the back of the chair. There's something about wet tweed that smells faintly of guilt. I'd almost finished the crossword. Times, naturally. The clue was, regret in retrospect, shapes Rome, 6. I stared at it longer than it deserved. Sometimes it's the simple clues that haunt you. Remorse, a word like a sigh, through teeth. I wrote it in just as Lewis entered, face drawn in that way of his that says he would rather be anywhere else but feels obliged not to show it. He sat across from me, shifting the water rings on the varnish with his sleeve. He said it quietly, almost apologetically. A senior fellow at St. Jerome's, not Latham, another, had been found dead at his desk. Late afternoon, door locked, curtain drawn, cyanide, and a note, though they hadn't released the wording. Suicide, they said. I frowned, not because of the death, though I've never grown immune to that weight, but because something pulled at me, quietly, from the corners of my memory, like the edge of a paper slipping off a table, waiting for the floor. Remorse. I asked Lewis to get the name. I lit a cigarette I wasn't supposed to have and watched the fog outside press its forehead to the window. Somewhere across town, the chapel bell at St. Jerome's would have rung, once for tradition and once, perhaps, for the man now slumped over his final footnote. There's a sound that clings to places like that. The scrape of chair legs, the ticking of radiator pipes, the silence after a door clicks shut. Oxford isn't made of stone. It's made of memory. And memory, as I've learned too often, is a deeply unreliable witness. But I already knew, even then, before the pathologist's report, before the handwriting analysis, before Lewis fetched me coffee in the grey light of morning, that this wasn't suicide. Not in the way they meant, because I remembered that corridor, that whisper, that pause in Latham's voice that hadn't quite been a breath. The dead man's name, when Lewis told me, meant nothing to me at first. But his desk I remembered. Too tidy, too deliberate. And that, I suppose, was where it all began. Not with a body, but with a word. They found him at dusk, though it could just as well have been midnight. The light in that part of the college, old quad, north-facing, never had much character. It fell like dust and stayed suspended in the air. A junior don, whose name I forget, and whose face was a flicker of freckles and nerves, had returned to fetch a volume of Propertius. He knocked politely, waited too long, then entered. The lamp was still lit. Latham was in his reading chair, one ankle crossed over the other, chin sunk low as if he'd merely dozed off during an unconvincing novel. The bottle on the rug, amber glass, catching what little light there was, said otherwise. Laudanum. Victorian in its neat cruelty. A letter lay by his side, only half written, which is its own kind of ending. Lewis told me most of this the next morning, cup of tea cooling in his hand, voice subdued, as though describing the weather. He said the coroner leaned towards suicide. No signs of struggle, no visible wounds. The lock on the door had clicked properly. The windows fastened. The bottle half empty. But something about it scratched at me. Not the act. I've known suicides, and I've known the weariness that births them. No, it was something quieter. A detail. The fire had been extinguished. In Oxford, in February, that's not a casual omission. The college flats are old enough to harbour drafts, and Latham was not the kind to waste comfort. A fire extinguished. Not simply allowed to die, but put out. And recently, the grate had been swept. Lewis didn't see it at first. He said perhaps Latham changed his mind halfway through lighting it. I looked at him and said nothing. Sometimes silence is the sharper instrument. There was something else, a calendar entry in Latham's pocket diary, written in his hand in that Roman cursive that somehow made even modern names look archaic. Hester, 3 p.m. That was all. No surname, no meeting location, but it rang like a lost key in a lock I hadn't yet found. I asked for the master. St. Jerome's master, Dr. Armitage, was a man born from rules and soft wool. A pale-faced logician who spoke as if each sentence needed clearance from 3 committees. We sat in his office under the gaze of 4 former masters, none of whom looked as though they'd been interrupted since Edwardian times. He expressed regret, naturally, sorrow, in appropriate tones, but there was beneath it the low hum of something else, not fear exactly, not guilt, something institutional, as though a complicated budget had been abruptly misplaced. The Latin department, he admitted after a silence, was undergoing strategic review. I asked what that meant in English. He offered a thin smile. Funding is increasingly directed toward more contemporary disciplines. Digital humanities, cognitive linguistics. Latin, I'm afraid, has struggled to defend its place, even here. And Latham, respected, of course, beloved by some, though perhaps not the most flexible of colleagues. He paused there, as if testing the word for sharpness. I asked if he knew anyone named Hester. He shifted. Said there had been a student. Hester Lee left last term. Not formally expelled, more a mutual understanding. She had apparently submitted an essay on Ovid that caused some discomfort among the faculty. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask him to, but he made one mistake. He said she'd left without fuss. Oxford doesn't do without fuss. Even its ghosts leave a forwarding address. Later that afternoon I walked alone to Latham's rooms. The porter unlocked the door without comment. The air still held a hint of tobacco, book dust, and something faintly medicinal. A room used to silence. I looked again at the hearth. Someone had used water. Not enough to drench, but enough to flatten the embers. And the letter, the half-written thing, addressed to no one. No greeting, just a beginning, half a page in. It was not unkindness that led me to it, though perhaps kindness had very little to do with it at all. Nothing more. I stood for a long time in that room, letting the silence settle around me. The rain began again on the window. Outside, somewhere in the quad, a bell struck the hour. It was just after 3. The thing about Latin is that it waits. Tenses hover unresolved. Meaning can be suspended indefinitely. Subjunctives that suggest but do not declare. Futures that never arrive. Like Oxford itself, the language is patient with ambiguity. It allows time to rot quietly. St. Jerome's was thinly populated that week. 3 full fellows in classics, a visiting scholar from Padua, with too many scarves and not enough vowels, and a scatter of postgraduates who moved like shadows from library to lecture room, uncertain whether they were still students or already ghosts. I wandered alone into the Latin classroom, the one from the first morning. Same shadows, same staleness in the air. Dust limned the beams above like forgotten grammar. The tutorial table remained half set, as though Latham might return at any moment to quiz someone on the ablative absolute or on Virgil's political quietism. I traced the spines on the shelf, each worn into familiarity. One volume, Livy, Book 6, caught my eye. It was well thumbed, the kind of book that carries heat even when left untouched. Inside, in a narrow, slanting hand, were notes written in pencil, sparse at first, then, by chapter 12, more fevered. Lines underlined, brackets, exclamation marks, and one phrase circled so often the paper had almost torn. Veritas numquam perit. Truth never dies. I closed the book. Truth in Oxford rarely dies, but it is often misfiled. Latham's rooms were as I'd left them, orderly and cold, the kind of space one lives in without softness. Books shelved by era, not author, Cicero beside Pliny, Tacitus aloof. I ran my finger along the top row and found not a single mote of dust. Precision like that is a form of belief, a defiance of entropy. On the desk, something new, an unopened letter dated a week prior. The bursar's seal. I slipped a knife through the flap. It was dull reading. Talk of departmental restructuring, provisional budgets, and a request for continued discretion in communications. The language of polite threat. Next to it lay a photograph in a brittle frame, angled away from the light. 5 men in light linen suits, squinting in midsummer brightness. A garden party, 1974. The note on the back read, I recognized a younger Latham, unsmiling even then. 2 of the others I knew by reputation. But the figure on the left had been carefully removed, not by accident. The shape torn out precisely, violently, as if erasure itself were the point. I took the photo. Downstairs I passed through the anteroom near the chapel, where the old college prizes were on display. Silver cups and faded certificates, brittle with age. I almost missed it. A small shield, dulled with years. The inscription was neat, unimaginative, Latin verse, 2019, Hester Lee. I stood for a long moment, the echo of her name rising from the paperwork Lewis had handed me that morning. A standard withdrawal. Form dry as chalk, barely initialed. Her prize sat there unmentioned. No note of commendation, no photograph, just the name, still engraved, still visible. There's a kind of cruelty in how institutions remember, names etched in metal long after the people themselves are meant to be forgotten. I made my way out into the cloister. Rain again, a fine mist, the sort that softens stone and hides footsteps. Behind me, somewhere deep in the college, a floorboard creaked, as if someone had just left or just returned. I didn't turn. Instead, I lit a cigarette I didn't want and walked toward the porter's lodge, the photo heavy in my pocket. 5 men in a summer garden, all wearing the same smile, except for the one now absent. Truth never dies, but sometimes it needs reminding. Cowley Road holds its own rhythm, the syncopated bustle of cafes with chipped tables, barbershops that never change hands, and bookstores wedged between vape shops and falafel stalls. It smells of curry leaves and paperbacks of Lives in Transition, a different Oxford, one not bound by cloisters or footnotes. We found her shelving Virago reprints beside a sign that said, "Women Who Were Right." A girl in her early 20s, though the word doesn't quite sit right. There was something prematurely cauterized about her. Sharp, yes, but in the way broken glass sometimes catches sunlight. She wore a jacket far too thin for the weather and a ring that looked older than she was. Her eyes flicked to me with vague recognition before dropping back to the shelf. Lewis introduced us with that careful professionalism he uses when the subject is young and female and possibly damaged. She didn't offer a handshake, just turned her back and returned to arranging books as if we were part of the furniture. "You must know why I'm here," I said after a pause. She didn't turn around, only said, with the coolness of someone who'd practiced it, "I'm not speaking about Professor Latham, not can't, not shouldn't, not." I told her it wasn't an accusation, just a conversation, that I wasn't interested in official versions. Those were always too neat. Still she shook her head, fingers tracing a spine without seeing it. "He taught me the difference between syntax and cruelty," she said. Her voice was level, but her hand trembled slightly as she slid the book into place. That's all I'll say. A phrase like that sticks. The kind you write down on a receipt and carry home in your pocket. I asked about the manuscript, the supposed translation. "A Roman satire," she said, eyes flickering for the first time. Something obscene and clever, something scholars barely acknowledged, but she had translated line by line, metre by metre. Latham had promised to help her polish it for publication. She had come back for it 3 weeks after her departure, with a USB drive and a letter of recommendation in her coat. They told her there was no such manuscript, that no file had ever existed, that the college had searched and found nothing. She didn't cry. I've seen crying, the messy, involuntary kind, the theatre kind. Hester Lee simply folded the memory back in on itself like a knife returned to its sheath. I asked if she'd shown it to anyone else. She hadn't. Trusted him. That word again seemed to ache in her mouth. We didn't press further. Lewis asked if she wanted to speak with someone, a solicitor or a counsellor. She smiled then, a thin crescent of exhaustion, and said, "I'd rather just go back to pretending it's not mine." Outside, the wind had gathered. Not the kind that howls. The kind that slips under your collar and makes you aware of your spine. In the car, Lewis stared ahead, both hands on the wheel, like a man who wished the road would take him somewhere simpler. He said nothing for a while. Then, "You believe her?" "Yes," I said, instantly, simply, because it wasn't just her words, it was the gaps between them. She wasn't hiding guilt, she was hiding injury. There's something very Oxford about that. As we pulled away, I looked out at the city, scaffolding on church spires, teenagers smoking beneath a "no loitering" sign, a woman walking alone with 3 books under one arm and a child under the other. I murmured, more to myself than to Lewis, "Mutato nomine dete fabula narratur." He glanced over. "What's that?" "Horace," I said. "Change the name, and the story is about you." And I wondered then just how many names had been changed to keep that college quiet, how many stories were still buried in its archives, written in the margins of other people's lives waiting to be erased. There's a certain type of scholar Oxford attracts, or perhaps creates. The sort whose elegance is deliberate, whose cordiality is a defense. Dr. Lorenzo Giusti was one of these. Impeccably dressed, Mediterranean in a tailored way, and always carrying something bound in leather. His eyes, quick, amused and slightly hooded, had the habit of resting on one point too long. The sort of man who makes you feel as though you've arrived at the end of a conversation you didn't know had begun. We met in the common room, late afternoon. Light fell slantwise through the mullioned windows, striping the ancient carpet in faded geometry. Giusti stood to greet me with a kind of continental grace, as if he were receiving a friend for coffee in some Venetian drawing room. He said, of course, he'd heard the news about Latham. Tragic, though they were not, he insisted, close. Colleagues, certainly, in the broadest, most academic sense. He had arrived to continue work on his monograph, something about memory and erasure in the annals of Tacitus. Latham's death, while lamentable, was unrelated to any of it. He smiled again, a smile that travelled only halfway up his face. I asked about the paper, Tacitus and the Ethics of Omission, co-authored with Latham in 1996, later retracted without comment. A quiet little scandal in certain footnotes, a curiosity in others. Giusti's accent flattened slightly. Just enough for me to notice. He said they had differing methodologies. A matter of scholarly divergence, nothing more. The past was always more instructive in theory than in practice. I showed him the photograph, the garden party, 1974. I watched the shift behind his eyes, recognition, then calculation. Old rivalries, he said, handing the photo back with 2 fingers. Latinists never forget. There was a silence between us then, the kind that weighs something. Outside, I found Lewis near the porter's lodge, thumbing through an envelope. He'd been speaking with the college secretary, who had a talent for smiling while revealing nothing, but he'd learned something useful. The college had recently petitioned to make Giusti's appointment permanent, an honorary fellowship, with housing and a vote on faculty committees. It had been blocked by Latham. No official explanation, just a sealed note to the master expressing concerns of academic integrity. Giusti had remained in residence, waiting, smiling, working on Tacitus. We returned to the guest ledger, a thick green book whose spine cracked like old bone. I turned to the page marked 4 days before Giusti's supposed arrival. His name was there, in slanted, stylish penmanship. But lightly beneath it, faint, erased, but not gone, was another. R.F. Lee. It had been scrubbed out with an eraser, amateurishly. A hint of graphite still visible under the lamplight. No room number listed, no checkout date, no signature. Lewis said nothing, just exhaled slowly. I asked the porter if there was a room switch that week. Sometimes visiting scholars, he said, arrive early and shuffle places when fellows object. He didn't recall specifics, only that Giusti had asked for a quieter room upon arrival. I stood then in the cold vestibule watching a student rush past, coat open, papers slipping from her folder like startled birds. I thought of Hester Lee, not just her name on a shield, or the tremble in her voice, but that strange, half-smothered sadness in her eyes. R.F. Lee could be a relative, could be a lie. Back in the common room, Giusti had vanished. His leather folder remained forgotten, or not, on the windowsill. I opened it. Latin drafts, scribbled notes, a postcard from Ravenna. And tucked between 2 pages, folded once, was a printed conference program from 2005. Latham's name was circled. So was the title of a talk, translating silence, lost voices in Augustan satire. Not Tacitus then, something older, something Latham had suppressed, and someone, or more than one, had refused to forget. Latin, after all, isn't dead, it's just waiting for someone to pronounce it correctly. And truth, like grammar, has a habit of revealing itself in revision. There is a particular hush in college chapels, not merely silence, but a kind of curated stillness, not absence, but presence held in suspension. St. Jerome's Chapel was smaller than most, barely seated 20 with comfort, but it had the proportions of something larger, as if designed for acoustics more than bodies. I arrived early for the Thursday rehearsal. Rain scattered lightly across the stained glass, just enough to blur the saints into suggestion. The organist, a doctoral candidate with soft shoes and softer shoulders, nodded but said nothing. Most of them don't, until the music begins. Felicity Braithwaite arrived precisely at 5, wrapped in a forest green shawl and carrying a tin of throat lozenges as if they were sacramental. She had the bearing of someone who had once stood at the front of too many rooms and learned, eventually, to stop apologizing for it. Her husband, a former fellow in theology, had died some years back. Cancer, I think, the kind that takes slowly, like ink bleeding through paper. They began with Tallis, then something modern I didn't recognize. I listened. Not for flaws in harmony, but for the air between notes. That's where the truth often hides. Felicity approached me after the final chord faded. She didn't ask who I was, only offered me a seat beside her on the front pew, where the candle wax had made a constellation across the wood. "You're here about Edwin," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. She looked ahead toward the altar, then away, as though recalling something she hadn't meant to keep. He always requested Lacrimosa dies illa. Never explained why, just asked, every term, without fail. He'd sit in that chair there, she gestured toward a modest seat near the south wall, and close his eyes. One evening, I saw him weep. No sound, just tears, deliberate and private. I asked if she knew why. He carried something, she said, like dust under the lid of an old box. It didn't escape, but it never settled. I stayed after she left, alone in the chapel. The organist packed quietly. The candles hissed faintly in the draught. I stood beside Latham's chair, looking at the stone floor beneath it. Polished by years, by grief maybe. It wasn't the music that caught me. It was the wood. There, just below the lip of the pew nearest the apse. A faint scratch. No more than 3 inches wide, carved with something sharper than a penknife, but not deep enough to be seen unless you were kneeling or searching for what others had missed. Invenies me ibi. 3 words. You will find me there. I don't know how long I stared. Long enough for the candles to burn low, long enough for the chapel to stop feeling like a room and start feeling like a page, one someone had tried to erase and failed. The scratch was old, but not ancient. Perhaps a few weeks, perhaps last Thursday. The rehearsal had been cancelled then. The chapel locked, no reason given. I asked Lewis later. He said the porter had received an anonymous request to close it for emergency fumigation. No records filed, no confirmation from the maintenance office, just an envelope slid under the door. And still the scratch remained. Lewis, ever practical, said it could have been a student prank, some bored classicist playing games with eternity, but I knew better. There's a difference between vandalism and confession. The words weren't idle, they were residue, like the scent left in a coat after someone else has worn it. You will find me there. I repeated it aloud once, in the empty space, and the sound returned to me slowly. Changed, as though passed through water. I did not yet know what they meant, but I knew someone had left it like a thread, and someone else, perhaps, had already followed it. There's an odd privacy to offices long vacated, the stale warmth of their interiors, the papery scent of stillness, as though the room has yet to realize it's been abandoned. I requested access to Latham's teaching materials through the bursary, who granted it with the bureaucratic solemnity of someone passing over a dead man's keys. The files had been boxed already, labelled, sorted, respectful, a careful erasure in progress. I brought them to the old senior common room, cleared the decanters aside, and began to read. Most were as expected. Lecture scripts annotated in Latham's particular, slanted hand, quotations in Latin, trailing into margins like footnotes lost in thought. But one folder was thinner than the rest. Inside it, an essay, thickly marked in red, not Hester's. The name at the top was unfamiliar until it wasn't. Robin Lee, title, satiric intent, and poetic persona in Juvenal 6. A competent subject, poorly handled. The red ink bled through margins. Blunt, impatient commentary. Then, near the end, a single word underlined twice. Plagiarized. But there was no formal note, no disciplinary summary, no attached correspondence, only a yellowed memo from the department secretary, dated 2 years prior, requesting the essay be removed from circulation. No reason cited, just an X beside the directive. I rang Lewis from the SCR phone. He answered on the third ring, breathless, somewhere between the archives and lunch. "Find out what you can about Robin Lee," I said. "Full name, matriculation, anything." An hour later, he met me on the quad steps, the wind tugging at his coat. Robin Francis Lee, admitted to St. Jerome's 3 years back, first in his year for Latin prose composition, disappeared halfway through his second year. Personal withdrawal. No further studies registered, no forwarding address. It didn't take a leap. Hester Lee's brother, a shared love of satire, a shared disappearance. But the reasons diverged. Hester left with something stolen from her. Robin, it seemed, had stolen something himself. It wasn't revenge, it was guilt. I returned to Latham's study late that evening. The light was low, as if dimmed by memory rather than electricity. On the desk, I reread the unfinished letter. Same phrase, still lodged in my mind. It was not unkindness that led me to it, though perhaps kindness had very little to do with it at all. But now I noticed something else. A smear near the bottom, where the ink had bled across one word, not blurred enough to erase it entirely. Restitution. It hung there, imperfect but unmistakable. The final word Latham had tried to set down, not repentance, not regret. Restitution. A weightier thing, a choice, not just a feeling. I called Lewis again. "What about the will? Any changes?" "We checked," he said. "Official version lodged last year, but the solicitor mentioned Latham had requested an update. 2 months ago, never submitted or never found. It wouldn't be unusual." Scholars, especially those like Latham, whose minds were catalogues and whose lives were cluttered with parentheses, often meant to leave order behind but departed mid-sentence. The solicitor confirmed a draft had been seen, referenced even, but when asked to produce it, Latham had merely gestured to a desk drawer and said, "Soon," a word that always arrives too late. I searched again, not the obvious places, not the desk nor the filing cabinet, but the books, the shelves, the margins. Inside a copy of Ovid's Tristia, tucked between pages too seldom read, I found a folded sheet. Legal paper, no signature, no witness marks, just a name, Hester Lee. The page had been folded twice, once in haste, once in care. It wasn't a will, not legally, but it was intention. "Morse," said Lewis beside me, gently, "what if this isn't about a crime at all?" I looked at him then, really looked, and said, "It is, but not the kind we prosecute." Outside, bells marked the half-hour. The wind picked up. Somewhere in the college, a door latched with finality. Guilt, I thought, has a longer half-life than grief. And sometimes restitution never arrives, only the echo of it. The Bodleian receives the dead gently, not in coffins but in cardboard, not with hymns but accession numbers. The manuscripts arrive catalogued, cleaned, named as if by botanists, MS Latin. HD 227, and then are left to sleep, folded between layers of tissue and obligation. It was Lewis who first suggested we check. I had until then believed the will might still be in Latham's rooms, mislaid, buried, hidden among his precision. But precision, I'd begun to understand, is not the same as clarity. Sometimes it obscures. The donation register was not digital, of course not. That would have offended the very building. A student with bitten nails and an apologetic cough retrieved the thick ledger, bound in calfskin, smelling faintly of mildew and certainty. I turned each page slowly, half expecting nothing. Then I saw it. Codex Leiensis. No such manuscript existed, no classical source bore the name. A ghost term, a conjuring, received 2 weeks ago, anonymous donation from the estate of the late Professor E. Latham. The name wasn't a name at all, it was a confession in disguise. I requested the item. The librarian hesitated. I waited. It arrived in a grey archival box, ribboned shut, the corners slightly softened with wear. Inside, a single, slender codex, vellum-bound, hand-stitched. Modern, curious. I opened it carefully. The contents were Latin, formal, poetic, hexameter, but wrong. Not in the way beginners err, not sloppy, not ignorant. No, this was wrong the way mimicry often is, too precise, too perfect. It imitated the past like a painting imitates a dream. It was satire, modern, acid, masked in Augustan robes. The poem wound through invocations of silence, betrayal, borrowed voices, and the shame of those who do not speak when they should. Not Juvenal, nor Horace. Something stranger, more wounded. Somewhere near the centre of the text was a phrase that stopped me. Quod scripsi, scripsi, sed alium debuit nomen habere. What I wrote, but it should have had another's name. I turned the final page. Tucked there, unfolded but foxed with age, was a concert program from the Sheldonian Theatre. Mozart, Requiem in D minor, folded once, then once more. On its reverse, in Latham's unmistakable hand, rigid, slightly trailing on the downstroke, a paragraph, not legalese, not composed, a will. I, Edwin Latham, hereby name Hester Lee as the sole literary heir of all my unpublished writings, translations, and annotated texts. Let this serve as restitution, though I know it arrives too late. I ask her only this: do not let what I destroyed remain destroyed. Signed, simply, E.L. No witnesses, no date, just intent. Morse, Lewis said softly beside me, why hide it? If he meant it, why not lodge it properly? I closed the codex. The answer sat uneasily in my chest. Because guilt seeks darkness, I said, not justice. Latham hadn't wanted the college to validate it. That would have required noise. Publicity a process? No. He wanted someone to find it after, when his hands could no longer be asked to clarify, when he could no longer be made to explain. He left it as one might leave a coat on a doorstep. Not to be claimed, to be found. Lewis frowned. But why die? I didn't answer at once. Instead, I thought of the chapel, the music he requested. Lacrimosa dies illa, that day of tears and ashes, a man who wept for it, though never said why. I thought of a student dismissed, a manuscript denied, a name half erased from a guest book, and I thought of the phrase etched beneath the choir pew. Invenies me ibi. You will find me there. I don't think Latham died for shame, or even for guilt. I think he died because he had spent so long pretending his silence was virtue that he no longer knew how to speak. The codex was his confession, the poem his witness, the will his penance, and like all second wills, it was not meant to save the estate, only the soul. Outside, Oxford leaned into the wind again. Term was ending. Students would be packing up soon. But somewhere in the archive's stillness, a voice, long buried, had begun again. Not in Latin, but in truth. The crossword sat before me like a wound I'd reopened. Its grid was nearly filled, but a single clue remained unsolved, or perhaps misunderstood. A poet remembered backwards misplaces blame. 7. I'd penciled in half a dozen possibilities over the past week. None stayed. A misquoted poet, a mistranslated line, a mistaken identity. Somewhere in that muddle was a key I hadn't recognized as such. The photograph returned to me then, the one from 1974, the garden party. 5 scholars in linen, light glancing off the rim of a champagne glass. And the tear. So precise, so intentional. A single face removed. I had assumed it was Latham's rival, Giusti. A convenient fiction. But the proportions were wrong, the positioning, the stance. It wasn't Giusti who'd been excised from that summer moment. It was Robin Lee. The silence broke in my head like a cello string. Discordant, but final. I rang Lewis. Meet me at the chapel. The chapel was colder than I remembered. The candles had long been cleared away. Only the wax constellations remained. Lewis brought a screwdriver. Unnecessary, really. The panel beneath the choir pew gave with less resistance than expected, as though it had been waiting. Inside, a tin box, the sort that once held sweets or tobacco. Modest, unassuming. We lifted it together. No label, no lock. The lid creaked. letters tied with a ribbon that had long since faded to a dull ochre. Folded carefully, kept dry. Some on college stationery, others on scraps of music sheets and blank margins torn from journals. The first was dated 1974, signed only R, but the voice was clear. He kissed me in the cloister when the organist left. I laughed, then apologized for laughing. He said, "You always do that, apologize for joy." Letter after letter, same hand, same cadence, a romance in fragments, tender, desperate, careful, then a change, the writing sharpened, the grammar more formal, less poetry, more pain. He says it cannot continue, that we have no place here, that Oxford is not ready, that I am not safe. The last letter was different, a different hand, more elegant, foreign, Italian flourishes. He loved him enough to let him go. I never could. Giusti. We stood in silence a while. Lewis shifted beside me but didn't speak. I said it aloud, softly, as though reading to the air. He loved him enough to let him go. I never could. It had not been blackmail, not scandal. It had been love. Forbidden in its time, unmentionable among their peers. Giusti had done the only thing he believed he could. Removed Robin from Oxford, quietly, irrevocably. A name erased from registers, a face torn from memory. And Latham, the coldest of them, the driest, had covered it. Absorbed the lie, filed the papers, signed the silence. He had done what the others had not. He had stayed. He had preserved Robin's dignity, even while helping to disappear him. But guilt, like Latin, doesn't decline gently. It lingers in the corners of syntax. It haunts tense. I sat on the pew's edge, the tin box resting between us. Lewis asked what we should do. Nothing, I said, not yet, because this wasn't about evidence. It wasn't even about crime. It was about a mistranslation, not of words, but of feeling. They had mistaken shame for protection, silence for kindness, erasure for safety, and only Latham bore the weight of that mistake. Year after year, verse after verse, until finally the scholar, who knew too well the difference between ablative and accusative, could no longer conjugate his own grief. Outside, dusk folded Oxford in its usual hush. Somewhere across the quad, the chapel bell rang once, then stopped. I looked at Lewis and said, "It was never meant to be found, but it was, and we did." The inquest was held in a pale municipal room with watermarks on the ceiling and a kettle that took 4 attempts to boil. Outside, traffic hummed without sympathy. Inside, the chairs creaked and the blinds admitted only a sallow light, as if reluctant to witness. No scandal, no dispute. The evidence was methodical. Laudanum, undisturbed surroundings, an unfinished letter. The coroner, a woman who wore her tiredness with the grace of someone too intelligent to disguise it, offered the verdict quietly. Suicide. No signs of coercion. No suggestion of foul play. I waited until the room had emptied, save for the cleaner and the smell of weak disinfectant. Then I turned to her. "He didn't die from laudanum," I said, buttoning my coat. She looked up. "What then?" "He died from decades of Latin." She didn't laugh. She only nodded once, as though she'd already known but hadn't found the phrasing. I left without another word. Sometimes answers require silence. Hester met me on the steps outside St. Jerome's. The manuscript was in a satchel at my side, the codex Latham had hidden beneath centuries of tradition and half a lifetime of shame. I handed it to her without ceremony. She took it slowly, as though it might vanish between her hands. Her eyes lingered on the cover. "I found it," I said, "in the archive. With your name disguised as a punchline." She said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, "He was always better at endings than beginnings." I offered no reply. The moment didn't need it. Giusti left Oxford the next morning. Lewis watched him board the train. 2 suitcases, a leather folio, and that particular air of someone escaping elegantly. He offered no farewells, no explanations. Only a note left on my desk, unsigned, written on university stationery, in his meticulous continental hand. Some truths arrive too late to help the living. Still, I am grateful you listened to the dead. No forwarding address, no return. The college returned to its usual silences. The chapel was reopened. The choir sang Lacrimosa dies illa the following Thursday, and someone, no one knew who, left a single violet on the pew where Latham used to sit. The plaque bearing his name remained untouched. No additions, no subtractions. Just the dates and a line in Latin too faint for most to read. Time in Oxford does not correct, it absorbs. That evening, in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and placed the record on the turntable, Requiem in D minor. I'd heard it 100 times, but that night it hurt differently. Like a sentence you've read before but only just understood. The crossword was waiting beside my glass, all but one clue completed. Love's grammar, corrupted by fear, 9. I stared at it, not thinking, not passing. And then it came. Forgiveness. I wrote it in slowly. The F lingered too long beneath the nib. I capped the pen and leaned back, listening. The violins rose like breath held too long. Dies irae flared in the speakers, then subsided. And when Lacrimosa began, that soft lamentation, neither despair nor absolution, I thought of Latham again. Not as he died, but as he once must have been. Young, terrified, brilliant, in love. He had carried his silence like scholars carry books they do not cite, not because they are unworthy, but because they are too personal. In the end, he did what so many of us do. He tried to translate the untranslatable, guilt, love, the grammar of what is left unsaid. I lowered my glass. The whiskey caught the fading light. Shadows lengthened across the bookshelves, softening the spines of Cicero, Catullus, Tacitus. The clock in the hallway chimed. I did not look up.